Welcome back to the next video in our Wized tutorial series. In this episode, we are going to be covering reading a single item from Airtable using Wized. A very quick recap on where we left off. We have been building on our Grok AI story generator, which we first just set up to create a story using their API and to display it on the page. That was the first part of the tutorial series. The next step was we introduced CRUD, create, read, update, and delete. With create, we started creating records inside of Airtable. With read, we have started reading those records, being able to list them on the page. What we started off with on our story vault page was reading a list or requesting a list, returning a list, loads of different terminology. And what that does is we used the render list feature inside of Wized. If I turn on my X-ray, go into my story vault card, we set up this very powerful list feature, which gets a list from a API request or from the response and renders out a list on the page. So that's the first part of reading a list. The second part is we want to be able to view more. And to do that, we need to be able to request a single item. So let's have a think about how we are going to do that. We're likely going to need a new request. We currently have a request for creating a story record, and we have a request for getting all stories. Now we could just use the get all stories request and just pull out the item that we want to view more on. However, it's typically better to create a new request for this. As an example, as your web app scales, you might only want to pull this information, the title and the prompt that are coming from Airtable. You might not want to pull all the other information, the full story, the temperature, for performance reasons. And what I mean by that is if we go into get all stories, in our request, we can limit what fields we want to return. Now, at the moment, we're not doing that, but if we were scaling up to hundreds of stories for tens of thousands of users, at some point, we would probably just restrict this or limit this to the fields that we're actually displaying on the page. So we are going to create a new request. I am going to call it get single story. And I'm going to pop that into the story CRUD folder. And as usual, the app we're going to select is Airtable. For method, we want to use get item. For our list that we have here, we had been using get list items for multiple. We want to just do get item. The base, as always, is just going to be our Wized Grok story generator, and the table is going to be stories. Next, we have record ID. Airtable automatically creates a unique ID for each record in our base. If we go over to Airtable, we can view these IDs in one of two ways. The first would be to create a formula field, and there is a formula option that we can enter to show the ID. The other is that if we expand out any of these, we can see up here in the URL bar the record ID. Of course, the other place that we have been seeing these is inside our requests. If we leave this as a draft and go back over to get all stories and go up into the request info and expand out the response, this is our response from the request. We can see their list of records in here. And if we open any one of them, we will see the ID in here. So what we need to do is we need to get this ID, depending on which record we want to view more of, we need to get that in here to the record ID field in the request. Now, there are a couple of ways that you could do this. We could have it so that when you click this button, it saves the value of a cookie or a local storage variable and uses that in there. The best way to do this is using URL parameters. The first is clarity and shareability. People can copy the URL, they can share it with someone else, and it will open that item immediately. People can bookmark them. It's good for SEO because every item now has an individual URL, and it's easier to debug and develop. We can just change the parameter in the address bar if we're on the live site, or in here inside of Wized. So it's a lot cleaner, more efficient, more useful than using cookies or variables. So how do we set those up? Firstly, let's jump over to Webflow. What I have created in Webflow is a new page called View Story. And it's a pretty simple page. There's a heading up here that does not have any attributes on it. There is a spinner here, and I'm going to call this not story gen spinner. I'm going to call it get story spinner. And I want Wized cloak on here because I want this to only appear when the request is running. Although actually this request is always going to be running, right? The only way you can view this story is if it loads. So every time a user is on the page, we're going to want to show that spinner anyway. So actually, we don't need the cloak there. We can just have it display straight away. Then I have what is a copy of the Story Vault card from the Story Vault page. And I've changed the Wized attribute to Story Vault card single. Then I've added a paragraph with an attribute for each piece of information that I want to display from Airtable. The other thing we need to do is we need to let users get to this page. Over on Story Vault, I have set the link for this View More button to go to this View Story page. So that's all for Webflow for now. Let's publish that to staging and go back over to Wized. Next, what we need to do is we need to add a URL parameter to each of these buttons. And we need to do that dynamically. The URL parameter for each of these buttons needs to be the Airtable ID for that button. So I'll turn on X-ray. I'll click into my button. Down towards the bottom here, we have an option for URL parameters. So what we'll do is we will click add parameter, and we don't have any URL parameters. So we're going to create a new one called story ID and save that. Then for the value, this is going to work very similarly for how we did the names and the prompts for each of our cards. So we want to access our request for get all stories. Actually, no, we don't. If you recall from the last lesson, we changed that over to a variable called all Airtable stories because we are filtering that from that search bar. If we use the request here, the information is going to get jumbled up when we start searching. So we want to use that, and let's return that and see what we get. We want to access this ID property. So to make the ID different for each item, all we need to do is use our iterator variable. That's going to take care of all the work of ensuring that each of the buttons gets the correct ID. And then we'll do .id. Good to go. I want to test out that that's working. So I am going to publish this, and we're going to go over to the staging site, and we're going to inspect those buttons. And we should be able to see the URL parameter in each one. There we go. You can see in here, we have the link to, oh, it's a little hard to see. We have the link to view story, and then we have the question mark, and we have story ID equals, and we have what looks like an Airtable ID. Actually, the best way to test this is just to click one of these. Let's open two. Up here, we have an Airtable ID ending D7G. And over here, we have a different one with MRW. That looks to be working. So let's close those out. Now all we need to do is we need to get the URL parameter into the request. And like many things, Wized makes this very easy to do. I've gone back over to my get single story request, and I'll go into record ID. All I need to do here is go into the data store, into navigation, into parameters, and click story ID. And that means that when this request runs, it's going to automatically grab that ID from the URL parameter and use it in the request. I love how simple it is. Okay, do we want to limit fields? No, we want to get all of them. Now we have 2 steps left. 1, we need to trigger this request whenever the user is on that view story page. And 2, we need to update the information on the page. Nice and straightforward. Let's go into Once Upon and get this set up. So, as usual, we need an event. We know by now that our requests are just requests. They are detached from the logic that decides when and how to activate or to call these requests. So over to events, we have story plus Airtable folder, get all Airtable records. Let's make a new one in here and we'll call it get single Airtable record. And pop that into the story plus Airtable folder. Okay, triggers. 2 ways I'd approach this. One is, do we have any unique attributes on the page? We do. We have our Story Vault card single. For the sake of efficiency though, I'm not going to use that because it's possible that at some point a user will go onto the app and for some reason they'll remove the URL parameter, or maybe they'll somehow find that page link and get access to it without having the URL parameter entered. In that case, because the attribute is there, it's going to try to run the request anyways. What I'd prefer to do is only run the request if the URL parameter exists. So for that, we're going to do a custom condition. And we are just going to do our parameter. We're going to put it in here and we're going to return it. And we don't need to check if it exists. We don't need to check its length. This will only run if it's equal to true. So it'll only run if there is a parameter set. And the action we want to take is we want to perform request get single story. So far, so good. Let's quickly set up this spinner. Turn on our X-ray. Get story spinner, visibility, render if. And I want to say that our request to get a single story is requesting. I also want this to be visible immediately before the request starts. So let's actually just play around with this and see what's going to happen. If we refresh the page, it does appear straight away. Okay. It's disappearing because the request isn't running because we don't have a parameter set. So let's go back to Story Vault and go into View More. Okay, now it looks like it is running properly. Next, we want to display our Story Vault card single once the request has finished and it's finished without any issues. So we want to render this if our get single story has requested and it is okay. All right. And now we see it appearing on the page. Before we start matching up this information, let's just refresh it and see if we're happy. I'm happy. And I just want to check that we are actually getting the information from here. So I'm going into Get Single Story, into the Request Information tab, and I'll just expand out the response. That looks good to me. Okay. So let us map each of these. First of all, we do have a title, I think, at the top here that is currently hidden. So we'll just go through and match these up one by one. Let's just see, are any of these being used more than once? The title is. Okay, so the title is already being used on the Story Vault page. two options. I can give this a separate attribute and target that instead. Because I want to, I may want to reuse this title. I may want to change it in the future, and I may want to change it in both instances. I'm going to keep it as the same attribute. And what I'm going to do is change what is displayed depending on the page. Actually, I can do it depending on, no, I'll do it depending on the page. Yeah, okay. So I want to say if n dot path is equal to story vault for on our story vault page, I want to return this code, which is going to go into our variable that gets searched by that search bar, and is going to return the field's name from the list. But if n.path is equal to view story, I want to show something different. I want to show r.getSingleStory.data dot fields dot created model name prompt response name. Yeah, same one. Okay. Just something to bear in mind. I think I've said this before on these tutorials. Be very careful about doing this. If you do this, this will change the path to equal view story, and it's just gonna change the page that the user is on. So just be very careful with this variable. Oh, well, not variable. This path. Just make sure that it's always these two equal signs. Okay, so if I refresh the page, I should be seeing the title there, but I am not. Let's open up the data store. N.path view story. Ah, silly mistake. Return. How about that? There we go. Okay. Then it's just a matter of going down and doing these for each one. Now, what I do want to do is I want to make these look nice. So I'm going to do all of these as HTML. And I want to return paragraph. And I want to bold the text. And I want to say model. And then I want to unbold the text for the next part. And then I want to have get single story dot data dot fields dot model, like so. Important to have this space in here. And I also need to close off the p tag like so. And I want to reuse this, so I'm going to copy that. And that is looking perfect. Let's just go through these one by one. Temperature, text type, HTML. Oops. Change this to temperature and change that to temperature. Nice. Max tokens, HTML. Paste it in. Max tokens. Oops. Created model name prompt response temperature. It looks like we are not getting max tokens. What do we have over in Airtable? We do have a value called max tokens. Let's go back into here, into our request. Get single story. Yeah, there's max tokens. Looks like it's just not coming up there. Now we do have an issue here in that the field name doesn't have an underscore in it. So generally you never see spaces in requests. You'd usually have an underscore or a hyphen, or there'd be no space whatsoever. I would have expected Airtable to send that back, because this is not going to work, right? So instead of changing this in Airtable, What we're using here at the minute is called dot notation. It allows us to just combine this information, or rather to pick out the specific information we want inside of an array, inside an object, in an object, using dots. The other type of notation that we can combine is called bracket notation. And that is going to look like this. And this should work if we take out the dot. We've actually seen this before. This is how we have been using our iterator variable. It does also work for requests like this. I tend to not use it, but in situations like this, very handy, and is actually the only way to do it. You can't use dot notation for this. So that looks to be working correctly as well. Okay. Create it. HTML. Paste that in. And I want to say created at, and I believe that might be outside of fields. Data dot created time. Now we may need to format this. Yes. This does not look great. It's a particular date format. I think AI is getting so ubiquitous and so useful that it's worth spending time on these tutorials digging into what I'm actually doing. So I have asked it, first of all, I asked it what date format is it, because that's useful to know. And I've asked it to provide JS or JavaScript to format it as an example, 12th of April, 2025. This is what it came back with. Now it's sometimes worth prompting further. So I asked in this case, can I zoom in here? Yeah. Is this the least amount of code this can be done with without using a library? What I mean by a library is that we would add in a JavaScript library or a package that has built-in features for formatting dates. Now there are libraries that do that. Moment.js is one that comes to mind. But I'm happy to just use vanilla JavaScript, as we'd call it, when we're not using any libraries to format it. So this has given me a more compact version of the code. Now it's a little harder to read and to understand. This is ChatGPT reckons it has kept it legible. If you're not as used to JavaScript, this gets a little trickier to understand. But hey, if it's going to work, it works, and it's less code. So let's use it. So let us, first of all, paste it in above here. And what we need to do is pass in the date to this function. So this is going to give us a function called format date, and it's going to give us an input called date. So what I want to do here is I'm going to create a new constant, and I'm going to call it formatted date. And it is going to be equal to format date. And we're going to pass in our request information, the created at time, like so. Then all we need to do is swap this out with formatted date. And again, I know this isn't a JavaScript course, strictly speaking, but let's just again go through this once more. Up here, we're declaring a function. The function is called format date, and it takes an input called date, or D. Now, we could just call this date, but because we asked ChatGPT to keep the code as short as possible, it has replaced date with just D, the letter. Then it is creating a new date object. A date object is a particular kind of object in JavaScript for dealing with dates. And then it's just giving us the code to take the date in the format that Airtable gives us and format it as something like April 12th or 12th of April 2025. So that's what that does. Then what we do is we're creating a new constant, which is a variable that doesn't change while the code is running at any particular moment. We're calling that formatted date, and we're setting it to the value of what the function will return if we pass in this information. So it'll run the function, and instead of just having D in there, when it runs the function, everywhere you see D, it is going to use that created time value from the Airtable request. Then what we're returning is again our HTML to give us our paragraph and our bold tags and the formatted date. And if we run it up here, we can see that it is working. And if we close out of it, working perfectly. Love it. Excellent stuff. Okay. Last up is the response. Same thing again. Let me be, I was going to say lazy, but let's say efficient. We'll grab our existing text from one of the other ones, click into it from the X-ray, change text type to HTML, and for the value, pop this in here, and we'll call it response, and we will return response, like so. Okay, now the response, if it's long enough, should take up multiple lines. Let's go back to Story Vault and test this out. We should be able to change to a different story. Go for this one. There we go. Looking good. This was one where we turned the temperature way up and it just gave us gobbledygook. We're missing the prompt, and I kind of like the prompt. The prompt is useful information. Let's very quickly add it. Back over to Webflow, into View Story. And, oh, I actually have prompt here already. That's one thing about the X-ray. Well, okay, it is showing it there. I just wasn't paying attention. So that is there, but again, we are using the same attribute as on the Story Vault page. So again, no need to rewrite code. Let's go into the title where we already have the logic to change what we show depending on if we're on the Story Vault or the View Story page. So let's grab that and click into the prompt, into the value, and let's drop that code down here and remove this because we're not interested in the name. We're interested in the prompt, and take that out too. If we're on Story Vault, we want to display this because previously we were using this code on the Story Vault page. And we can, oh no. Control undo is, okay, there we go. Keyboard shortcut was failing me. So take that out and that looks good. If we're on Story Vault, use the variable with all stories. Else we want get single story dot data dot fields dot prompt, like so. But we want to return it. And we also want HTML. So now the issue is we can't change if it is plain text or if it is HTML for this single attribute. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change it to HTML. And for this one, I'm just going to change this to have p tags plus to concatenate, put in the prompt, and then close out the p tags. And then format this the way I want, which would be our opening p tag, our opening bold tag, prompt with a space, close out the bold tag, pop in the prompt, and then concatenate the closing p tag. Okay, very important, especially as your application gets bigger. Don't just trust yourself that this is going to work, right? If you don't go test this and then go working on a bunch of other features for a couple of days and then come back and this is not working, it can just become a headache. It can take you a couple of minutes or half an hour to figure out, you know, actually I did change this a couple of days ago. So we'll go back to Story Vault and just make sure that our prompt is still there. Yes, it is. Okay. All good. Back in here, and there we have our prompt. And that is it, ladies and gentlemen. We are now reading a single story whenever we click through. Let's just publish this and play around with it so we can see those URL parameters more clearly. So you'll notice that when I click the preview button or the go to staging URL button up here, it will actually copy any of the parameters that are stored inside of Wiz. So because we clicked through to this story from our story vault, the URL parameter gets set. That actually gets copied through, which is quite handy for testing. So this looks to be working fine. Now, if we wanted to add to this, we could set an error message where if the user changes the URL parameter for some reason, and there isn't one there, we could display an error there. If you want a little challenge to do as you're following along with this, that's my challenge for you. If this request fails, or if it's unable to find a record, display an error message here. So a quick recap. We set up our new page, view story in Webflow. This has a spinner. It has a copy of our story vault card with a new attribute, story vault card single, and it has a list of the information that we want to show. In Wized, we created a new request, get single story, which uses the get item method, and we set this to pass in a record ID from a URL parameter. On the story vault page, we went into our view more button. We added a URL parameter. We didn't have any, so we created a new one called story ID. And this is set to the ID value from our variable that lists all of our stories. So when the list is rendered with all of this information, it also adds a URL parameter to the end of the link, and the link is set to go to that view story page. When we click on our link, it is going to set the story ID parameter up here. And we then created an event, get single Airtable record, and this fires as a custom condition whenever the parameter exists. So if the parameter is in the URL bar, this event is going to fire, and the event is set to run that get single story request. We then have some visibility. We show the spinner initially, then we show the card, and we load in the information. Some of these elements are reused from the story vault page. So we have some if-else logic that sets the text depending on what page we're on. And finally, we got ChatGPT to create a function for us that will format the date as it comes in from Airtable as a more human readable date. So up next, we are going to look at the U in CRUD, which stands for update. We're going to add the ability to update a comment field with a comment for each of those stories, have that update in Airtable, and be able to see that updated comment on the story when we view an individual story. As always, if you're enjoying these, do give us a like and a subscribe. That favors us in the eyes of the YouTube algorithm. And if there's any videos that you would like to see in particular, or if you have any feedback or comments, drop them in the comment section below. Appreciate your time. Keep on building with Webflow and Wized.